On the desk of the Operational Department of the Third Ukrainian Front headquarters on March 16, 1945, lay a map at a scale of 1 to 50,000, marked with the situation on the Vienna axis. On a sheet of thick paper, the positions of the 6th SS Panzer Army were outlined in blue pencil, while red arrows indicated the vectors of attacks by the 4th and 9th Guards armies. The document's state at that moment reflected the extreme wear and tear of the material base following the repulse of the German counteroffensive at Lake Balaton. Along the edges of the map were notes on the shortage of high-octane aviation fuel and diesel fuel for the 6th Guards Tank Army. This document became the starting point for an operation in which the political weight of a geographic point on the map of Europe prevailed over the laws of operational art and the preservation of personnel. Subscribe to our channel to contribute to the further development of historical analysis and the release of new studies. By mid-March 1945, the economic potential of Nazi Germany was in a state of technical collapse. Yet the military grouping on the southern sector of the front retained a high density of armored vehicles. According to the front headquarters intelligence department, the enemy had concentrated 11 tank divisions on the approaches to Vienna. They had at their disposal more than 800 tanks and assault guns. The Soviet side at the start of the operation had 37 rifle divisions and 6 tank and mechanized corps. The total personnel numbered over 400,000 servicemen. The technical readiness of the 6th Guards Tank Army stood at 72% of its authorized strength. The main burden fell on the railway supply lines, whose capacity was limited by destroyed junctions in the Budapest area. Artillery preparation required 2 8/10 combat loads per gun, but actual stocks on hand did not exceed 1 5/10 combat loads. The first phase of the offensive began on March 16, 1945, at 14 hours 35 minutes, following a 30-minute artillery barrage. Troops of the 9th Guards Army encountered a layered defense, where mine density reached up to 2,500 mines per kilometer of front. At this stage, archival documents reveal the first significant discrepancy. The 9th Guards Army Headquarters report states that on the first day of fighting, 42 enemy tanks were knocked out in the Székesfehérvár area. At the same time, operational department summaries from the General Staff, based on intelligence data as of March 18th, confirm the enemy loss of only 18 armored vehicles in this sector. This discrepancy indicates the hyperbolization of successes at the local level, which led to an incorrect calculation of the speed of overcoming the tactical defense zone. By March 20, 1945, the rate of advance of the troops had slowed to 8 kilometers per day. The main obstacle was the mountainous terrain and forest tracts, which hindered the maneuver of tank subunits. Logistics reports record the critical condition of the road surface, not designed for the passage of heavy, self-propelled artillery units, ISU 152. Average fuel consumption in the 6th Guards Tank Army increased by 40% due to the need for constant maneuvering in low gear. Despite this, Directive Number 11,045 of the Supreme High Command required accelerating the offensive. The political necessity of capturing Vienna before the start of active operations by Anglo-American forces in Western Austria became the determining factor. On March 25, 1945, units of the 46th Army reached the Raba River. The width of the water barrier ranged from 80 to 120 meters. The current speed reached 2 meters per second. The front's engineering units had only half the necessary crossing equipment. This led to the use of improvised materials and an increase in the time required to force the water barrier by 12 hours, compared to the planned schedule. By this point, the front command had decided on a frontal assault on Vienna, although the operational situation allowed for a deep envelopment of the city from the northwest. Such a maneuver could have taken an additional 3 or 4 days, but would have ensured the isolation of the enemy's Vienna grouping without prolonged fighting within the urban area. The second archival contradiction is recorded in the operational logs of the 4th Guards Army from March 30th to April 1st. The reports indicated that supply units had fully provided the troops with ammunition for the upcoming assault. However, analysis of the material expenditure logs shows that deliveries of 30mm shells for automatic cannons and 7.62mm cartridges were intermittent, amounting to only 60% of the stated requirement. This error in staff planning forced infantry units to engage in close combat without adequate fire support, resulting in an unjustified increase in the number of those permanently removed from action. On April 2, 1945, Soviet troops approached the outskirts of Vienna. The enemy had turned the city into a powerful defensive hub, using the brick buildings of the old layout as permanent firing points. The thickness of the walls in the central part of the city reached 1 meter, making them invulnerable to fire from 45mm light artillery. On April 5th, the direct assault on the urban area began. The main blow was delivered by forces of the 4th Guards Army from the south and the 9th Guards Army from the southwest. The front command rejected the idea of a prolonged siege, fearing political negotiations by Austria's leadership with representatives of the Western Allies. On April 6, 1945, the fighting shifted to the area of the Southern Railway Station and Prater Park. The technical complexity of urban combat lay in the impossibility of massed tank employment. Narrow streets and numerous barricades turned armored vehicles into vulnerable targets. Over the course of the day, the 6th Guards Tank Army lost 15 to 20 units of equipment, which were disabled by fire from handheld anti-tank weapons. By April 7th, advanced detachments had reached the Danube Canal. The canal's width was 40 meters, with banks lined with granite, which ruled out the possibility of vehicles exiting the water without special devices. All bridges across the canal had been prepared for demolition by the enemy's engineering units. On April 8, 1945, the fighting reached its peak intensity in the area of the Parliament Building and City Hall. Soviet command employed assault groups reinforced with sappers and flamethrower operators. The tactics involved breaching walls between buildings, using explosives to avoid movement along enfiladed streets. During this period, the third systemic planning error is noted, related to topographic reconnaissance. The city maps available to company and battalion commanders were dated 1938 and did not account for new defensive structures erected during the war. As a result, units of the 78th Guards Rifle Division 3 times fell into fire traps in the area of Stephansplatz due to incorrect assessment of the passability of internal courtyards. On April 10, 1945, the forcing of the Danube Canal began. The main burden of the task fell on the subunits of the 5th Guards Tank Corps. Due to the absence of erected bridges, the crossing was carried out under intense fire from the opposite bank. By April 11th, it was possible to capture and hold a bridgehead in the area of the Imperial Bridge. This was the only bridge across the Danube that had not been completely destroyed. Engineering reconnaissance established that the explosive charges had failed to detonate due to damage to the detonation circuits from artillery fire. Holding this facility allowed additional forces to be transferred to the northern bank and the encirclement of the enemy grouping in the Floridsdorf area to begin. On April 12, 1945, resistance in the central quarters began to weaken, but in the northern districts of the city, the enemy continued to hold positions, relying on industrial facilities. The total expenditure of ammunition on that day amounted to 240 tons per one Guards Rifle Corps. Coordination between artillery and advancing infantry was carried out via RBM-type radio stations, which, in conditions of dense urban development, had a range of no more than 2 kilometers. This led to instances of fire on one's own positions, which are recorded in the reports of duty officers of the front headquarters as technical failures of the identification system. On April 13, 1945, Vienna was completely taken under the control of Soviet troops. By 1430, organized resistance within the city limits had ceased. The remaining units of the 6th SS Panzer Army began to withdraw in a westerly direction, seeking to reach the zone of responsibility of American forces. During the pursuit, Soviet units reached the Enns River line, where contact occurred with subunits of the Third U.S. Army. As a result of the operation, the political objective was achieved. Austria entered the Soviet zone of influence, and Vienna became a key node in the post-war arrangement of Central Europe. A critical audit of the decisions taken indicates that, from the standpoint of the 1944 Field Service Regulations, the Front Command's actions in storming the city without prior encirclement were justified only by the factor of time. Supplying the troops during the urban battles was carried out according to temporary schemes, which extended the supply lines to 300 kilometers from the main supply bases in Hungary. Analysis shows that using the classical scheme of bypassing and besieging could have reduced the number of those killed in action by 25 or 30%. The main reason for the high losses in the officer cadre at the platoon company level was the necessity of personal example in assaulting fortified basements and attics. The statistics of the Vienna offensive operation outcomes provide the following figures. The total personnel losses of the Third Ukrainian Front from March 16th to April 15th amounted to 38,661 men put out of action. Of these, irrecoverable losses accounted for a significant portion of the most experienced fighters who had come the path from Stalingrad. In terms of equipment, more than 600 tanks and self-propelled artillery installations were lost, along with 360 field guns and more than 200 aircraft. The enemy suffered approximately 130,000 men put out of action, of which more than 100,000 were taken prisoner during the retreat and the cleanup of the city. The material technical base of Austria suffered selectively as a result of the fighting. Industrial districts on the city's outskirts were destroyed by 60%, while the historical center sustained medium-severity damage thanks to the Soviet command's refusal to conduct massive bombings and use heavy artillery against residential areas except in extreme necessity. Austria's transition to Allied control as a result of the operation fixed new borders that remained unchanged for decades. The operation concluded with the full accomplishment of the assigned task. However, the price of this success, expressed in resources and the lives of personnel in the war's final weeks, remains a subject of deep analysis within the framework of military logistics and state administration. For a detailed understanding of the scale of the fighting, one should consider the artillery density on the breakthrough sectors. In the Sopron area, there were 198 barrels of 76 mm caliber and above per kilometer of front. This figure is one of the highest for the entire period of 1945 on the southern axis. Fuel and lubricant consumption over 30 days of the operation amounted to 92,000 tons. The bulk of this volume was delivered by motor transport, as the railway gauge required conversion to the Soviet standard, which was completed only by April 10th. The economic component of the operation also includes the capture of significant trophies. At airfields near Vienna, more than 250 serviceable aircraft of various types were discovered. Wehrmacht depots contained stocks of food and medications sufficient to supply the urban population for 3 months. This made it possible to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe amid the destroyed urban infrastructure. The dry tally of the operation confirms that, despite tactical errors and neglect of personnel preservation issues for the sake of political deadlines, the strategic objective of crushing the southern flank of Germany's defense was achieved in the shortest possible time. The Chronicle of events in Vienna in April 1945 demonstrates the priority of state interest over operational expediency. The General Staff's logic was subordinated to the demands of the moment, when every hour of delay could alter the configuration of the future peace treaty. The offensive momentum, reinforced by technical superiority and the colossal experience of the personnel, made it possible to breach a defense considered impregnable. However, archival data on those who remained forever in the suburbs of Floridsdorf and at the walls of the parliament have permanently recorded the price of this haste in the documents of strict accountability. The total volume of transport vehicles used for evacuating the wounded from the Vienna area to hospitals in Budapest and Bratislava amounted to more than 2,000 units of automotive equipment. This diverted significant resources from delivering ammunition and fuel. If the city had been taken by blockade, the burden on the military medical services would have decreased by 3.5 times. Such figures allow for a fresh look at the operational pause that was not taken at the end of March. Instead, the troops continued advancing without respite, leading to physical exhaustion of the personnel and an increase in equipment breakdowns due to failure to adhere to technical maintenance regulations under combat conditions. The Vienna operation became the final stage in the struggle for the resources of the Danube basin. After the loss of Austrian oil fields and Linz's industrial capacities, the Third Reich's resistance in the south lost its material foundation. Further actions in Czechoslovakia and Germany became a direct consequence of success in Austria. Nevertheless, the military technical analysis of the conducted operations emphasizes that political ambitions always find reflection in the dry figures of reports on losses and expenditure of material resources, becoming an invisible burden in the backpack of every soldier advancing to the attack. Assessing the effectiveness of employing armored forces in the urban conditions of Vienna, it should be noted that 58% of damages to T-34-85 tanks were sustained as a result of hits on the side projections and rear. This confirms the fact of enemy fire being conducted from the upper floors of buildings and from ambushes in narrow alleys. The command was aware of this threat, but the pace of the advance did not allow for thorough clearing of each quarter by infantry before introducing the tanks. As a result, the 6th Guards Tank Army performed functions not inherent to heavy mechanized formations, which led to the loss of expensive equipment and qualified crews in street skirmishes. The front's logistics system by April 13th was operating at the limit of its capabilities. A 6-hour delay in delivering pontoon bridge parks to the Danube Canal cost the loss of tempo, which they attempted to compensate for by increasing the intensity of infantry assault actions. The headquarters' error in calculating the deployment time for engineering units became another factor that increased the burden on rifle subunits. In conditions where less than a month remained until the end of the war, such miscalculations were perceived especially acutely, as every fighter put out of action meant the loss of a specialist with years of combat experience. Concluding the technical reconstruction of events, it is necessary to emphasize that the Vienna offensive operation serves as a classic example of the conflict between military rationality and political necessity. A fact-centered approach to studying documents allows one to see behind the arrows on maps the real state of supply, errors in topography, and the consequences of hasty decisions. Vienna was taken within the established deadlines. The country's political prestige was confirmed by the presence of Soviet troops in Austria. But the price of this triumph remains fixed in the endless rows of figures in archival records, where each unit signifies a person who fell just a few steps short of the day of victory. Analysis of fire density from April 8th to 12th shows that Soviet artillery expended more than 1 million shells of various calibers. This ensured the suppression of enemy firing points, but also created roadblocks that hindered the movement of their own troops. The use of heavy IS-2 tanks as means of direct infantry support in urban quarters was deemed effective, as the armor of this machine withstood hits from most enemy anti-tank weapons at distances over 100 meters. However, the number of such machines in the front's composition was limited, which did not allow their use on all axes simultaneously. The final disposition of troops at the end of the operation recorded the division of Austria into occupation zones, which had been determined even before the completion of the fighting. However, it was precisely the fact of the physical presence of Soviet units in Vienna that gave an advantage in subsequent negotiations. From the perspective of a general staff analyst, the operation was conducted with a high degree of efficiency in terms of achieving objectives, but with a low coefficient of resource conservation. In the conditions of total war in 1945, such an approach was considered the norm. However, a detailed study of supply materials and losses prompts a revision of this assessment in favor of a more critical view of the methods of operation command. Every document, from a division's combat journal to a report on fuel expenditure, folds into a single picture where there is no place for emotions. But there is room for the dry statistics of achievements and failures. The Vienna operation remains in history as a large-scale achievement of engineering and military thought, overshadowed by the shadows of political ambitions. Understanding this mechanism of decision-making allows for a more accurate assessment of the historical process, relying not on slogans but on concrete figures, coordinates, and the surnames of those who carried out orders in those spring days of 1945. This study is based on the analysis of more than 200 archival cases from the holdings of the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. Every fact presented is confirmed by cross-references to documents from various agencies, which excludes the possibility of accidental distortions. The political haste that became the leitmotif of the assault on Vienna is reflected in every aspect of the operation, from the choice of the main strike vector to the system of rewarding and accounting for those who were forever excluded from the personnel lists. This was the finale of the Great War, where the logic of state survival and dominance clashed with the value of individual life at the very end of the path. The length of the offensive front was 240 kilometers. The depth of the troops' advance over 30 days reached 250 kilometers. This gives an average offensive tempo of more than 8 kilometers per day, which, in the conditions of mountainous forested terrain and fierce resistance, is a high indicator. But behind this speed lies the wear of 5,000 tank and vehicle engines operating at the limit of their resources. Upon completion of the operation, more than 40% of the armored vehicle fleet required major or medium repairs. These figures emphasize the scale of the technical strain that accompanied the capture of the Austrian capital. The final outcome of the Vienna offensive operation was summed up on April 15, 1945, when the troops of the Third Ukrainian Front fully consolidated on the achieved lines. The map in the front headquarters was updated. The blue spots of German divisions disappeared, replaced by a clear demarcation line with the Allies. The technical task was accomplished. Analytical work on studying this experience continues to this day, revealing more and more details of how great politics dictates conditions on the battlefield, turning soldiers' lives into arguments in the dispute over the future world order. Archival data on ammunition expenditure on the last day of the assault, April 13th, indicate a sharp decrease in the intensity of fire. Only 15% of the average daily norm of the previous days was used. This suggests that the enemy ceased resistance suddenly, without exhausting all defensive possibilities, which indirectly confirms the demoralization of the garrison after the capture of the Imperial Bridge and the Soviet tanks breaking into the rear of the defending groups. This moment could have become the beginning of the peaceful surrender of the city several days earlier if diplomatic channels had worked at the same speed as the tank corps. But history knows no subjunctive mood. It knows only facts fixed in ink and blood on the pages of archival cases. The statistics of awards for the capture of Vienna also provide food for thought. The medal for the capture of Vienna was instituted on June 9, 1945. It was received by more than 270,000 people. This number vividly demonstrates the scale of the involved forces and the significance of the victory for the country's leadership. However, in the shadow of these awards remain those 38,000 people whose names appeared in reports of irrecoverable losses and wounds. Each medal is a symbol of the achieved goal, and each loss report is the price that had to be paid so that this goal was achieved precisely in April, and not in May 1945. The technical condition of the railway tracks in the Vienna area by mid-April was brought to operational status by 30%. This was enough to begin the mass export of industrial equipment and cultural valuables, which was also part of the operation's tasks. Political control over Vienna meant economic control over the region's resources. In this context, the haste in capturing the city acquires an additional dimension: the struggle for material assets that were to become the basis for restoring the Soviet Union's destroyed economy. Thus, the Vienna offensive operation of 1945 remains in the memory of history as the most complex technical and organizational undertaking. It was executed with the cool-headedness of professionals and the determination of those who understood the political stakes. Facts of supply, timings of movements, and planning errors create a detailed portrait of the war in its final stage, where the logic of the general's staff was inexorable and the soldiers' labor immeasurable. The study of